There's also a monetary inflation. And a monetary inflation means, very simply, if you produce more money and credit, if that increase is greater than the production of the goods and services, prices will go up. It creates a spiral, which we're seeing now. In other words, the selling of bonds. So it makes the imbalance become greater because not only do you sell the bonds to pay for the deficit governments do, but holders of bonds choose to sell bonds because they're not producing a good real return. Now that just mechanistically may be a little bit tricky for some people, but what that means is when you have a big supply-demand imbalance like that, either interest rates have got to go up to curtail that demand, or the central bank has to print more money, and they always print more money. So that dynamic of monetary inflation, the type of thing that makes the 70s, or the type of thing that makes inflationary depressions like happened in the Weimar Republic in Germany in early 1920s, that kind of inflation I don't think is paid enough attention to. Inevitably, there's a certain amount of debt that has to be paid. And one man's debts are another man's assets. And the more debt you have, the bigger the problem is. And so when you have a lot of debt and you have to pay it back, you're either going to pay it back in hard money or you're going to pay it back in depreciated money. And that becomes the choice of the central bank. That's why you get stagflations. That's why we have an environment like we have now. You have economic weakness. You have a stagnant economy, low growth, and with high inflation. And that happens through this monetary situation that I'm describing, in which the central bank tries to deal with a middle course. In other words, what does the central bank want? Not too high inflation and not too low growth. And so when there's a lot of debt, because one man's debts are another man's assets, it becomes very difficult balancing act. And that is when you have stagflation, when you produce it. So just like in the 1960s, late 60s, we spent a lot of money on guns and butter, we called it, right. The Vietnam War, social programs, and so on. We wrote too many checks relative to the money we had in the bank, which was gold at the time. 1971, the devaluation. Then they print a lot of money into that stagflation. So stagflation is the middle course when there's two different. So think about it this way. How does he literally fight inflation? Because everybody says tight money policies, and how do you fight inflation? The way that happens is you get people to spend less by taking money and credit away from them. So he will reduce the amount of money and credit that's available. The Federal Reserve is going to sell $1.1 trillion of debt that it has, debt assets, bonds, and then they're going to raise interest rates. So they create a squeeze that reduces demand at the same time as people don't have enough money because inflation is high. The buying power is less. And then what that act is to reduce buying power again to reduce inflation, but it comes at a big cost, and that is stagflation. I want to explain inflation in a very simple way. There's a certain amount, quantity of buying, that is of how much money and credit you're given, divided by the amount of quantity of goods and services sold. In other words, if there's a lot more money and credit produced than there is goods and services produced, you will have an inflation, and the magnitude will be a function of that ratio. Over that period of time, there was a very enormous amount of money and credit that was produced, and there were some bottlenecks and shortages of production and disruption because of mostly of a combination of COVID and also geopolitical issues. So there was some effect. Most of the inflation came from the production. We attribute it. We can go down to actually calculate it. Most of that was due to the enormous increase in money and credit and spending that was produced. If you now look at the United States, it's no longer dominant militarily.